Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a professor for social work management, and you are listening to Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners.
Intercultural competence of managers and employees represents a necessary key qualification in all industries. Also, social work professionals increasingly deal with members of different cultures, groups, and minorities. In this way, intercultural competence has become an indispensable prerequisite in the social work profession. In this episode of Managing Around, I will give you a glimpse of how intercultural competences are relevant to social work management. I start with a brief description of what the term intercultural competence can mean and will discuss later its impact on the field of social work management. First, let's get started with a definition of what intercultural competence is. The concept of intercultural competence has been extensively discussed with critical distance in the social sciences, cultural studies, and economics. A well-known definition of intercultural competence is from Alexander Thomas, a German psychologist. And from him comes today a definition from his 2003 paper. And I quote from the text: "Intercultural competence is shown in the ability to grasp, respect, appreciate, and productively use cultural conditions and related factors in perceiving, judging, feeling, and acting in oneself and in other persons in the sense of mutual adaptation, tolerance towards incompatibilities, and a development towards synergy-promoting forms of cooperation, living together, and action-effective orientation patterns with regard to world interpretation and world shaping." End of quote. This is not only impressive, but also the longest definition in the respective literature, as I know, and the result of 30 years of academic research. As such, intercultural competence serves to include and classify certain recorded actions of people which can be assessed as efficient or not efficient, appropriate or not appropriate, and successful or not successful. It should be emphasized that this assessment can only be evaluated ex post or with reference to past actions, irrespective of the professional and practical fields. In other words, we can only understand intercultural competence in retrospective. Let's move on to our second aspect today, which is about the question: how is intercultural competence relevant to the social work profession? A discussion in the context of social work, especially the explicit consideration in the human resources management of social organizations, still seems to be in the need of development. There is a consensus that interculturality is an essential component of the professionalism of social work professionals from both a theoretical and a practical point of view. Rowena Fong, in her text from 2009, speaks in the context of social work of a culturally competent practice, which can be understood as, and I quote from the text, "the process by which the social worker, engaged with persons from a different race and ethnic background, gathers knowledge about his or her ethnic client's cultural values and traditions, and is able to assess, provide, and evaluate interventions that are culturally appropriate for the ethnically diverse client caseload." End of quote. Social work professionals increasingly deal with members of different cultures, groups, and minorities. And in this way, intercultural competence becomes an indispensable prerequisite for the understanding of different problems and situations, ethnic contexts, and life situations. Often, either limited experience or insufficient knowledge about cultural differences and commonalities, values and norms, and skills and abilities of social workers poses a significant challenge. Culturally sensitive and competent social workers must acquire knowledge about learning theories and practical methods and interventions, which can originate from both Western and indigenous cultures, and should always also take into account contextual factors and frameworks such as families, groups, communities, and organizations. Culturally competent professionals should have intercultural knowledge and skills, especially in the following areas. First, about general assessment and evaluation. Social workers should understand related socio-cultural factors that influence their assessment in working with different ethnic cultures. For instance, in diagnosis and planning treatments. Second, individual casework. When gathering information about the client's perspective, social workers should take a closer look at the family context. For instance, the position of women in the family, gender roles and expectations, and need also bear in mind power-sensitive issues when choosing translators. Third, educational support. Social workers should identify and question social relations within families and across generations. For example, how they communicate and make decisions, especially regarding relationships, family support systems, or diaspora communities. Fourth, group-related assistance. Social workers should be sensitive to group dynamics, in-group and out-group behavior of clients, and the socio-cultural environment. It should be noted that different ethnic communities are always internally diverse. Davis, Galinsky, and Schobler from 1995, for example, developed the RAP method. It's a framework that consists of 3 factors: recognize, anticipate, and problem solving, which can be useful as a method and tool for assessing leadership competencies. Leaders need to anticipate how problems and possible discrimination among group members can be developed and changed. And fifth, community work. Social workers should explore which resources a community has to support its members, how cosmopolitan the respective socio-spatial environment is, and how governance structures are organized in a community. Taking all these 5 suggestions to include intercultural competences in the daily social work shows that the complexity and subjective nature of this fundamental concept also poses a challenge in leadership. Intercultural leadership styles and models are to a high degree dependent on the respective corporate culture, the lived values and basic assumptions about working together, such as politeness, respect, and tolerance. In each social work organization, leadership styles need to be reflected both if they are culturally inclusive and also respect the needs of the diverse clients. This brings us to the last part of this episode. What kind of lessons can be learned and conclusions to be drawn? Intercultural competences in leadership and international collaboration in social work organizations have become an indispensable prerequisite for successful professional practice. In the context of professional development, social work organizations increasingly have to ask themselves to what extent intercultural competences of frontline staff and managers can be developed, and a culturally sensitive organizational culture can be achieved in the best possible way. Additionally, future research should in particular examine the success factors of cultural leadership in greater depth, also in social work organizations. To conclude, in today's episode, I started with a brief description of what intercultural competence is and discussed its impact on the field of social work management. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are interested in this kind of research, please contact me or scroll through the article mentioned in the show notes that has been published this year.
Thank you for listening. Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners. If you liked this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast website. There's also a link in the show notes. If you've got any thoughts on this episode, or if you've got any idea about new podcast topics or questions you'd like to discuss, send me an audio file or voice note to hi@profmanagement.de. For any non-audio comments, drop a tweet or DM to @profmanagement on Twitter or Instagram, please. For more information, visit my website www.profmanagement.de. Thank you for listening and see you next time.